Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the 17th edition of the Online Education Leadership Forum panel discussion series focused on transforming education for human flourishing. The 17th edition is supported by Traverse.link, a science-backed super learning LMS platform, and Flowster, a process and workflow management software. Thank you so much for investing your time with us on a weekday. My name is Aaryan Salman, and I am the moderator for this panel discussion. Today's panel is unique and special in more ways than one. It is my great pleasure to be in the august company of stellar educational leaders who are also authors of the upcoming issue of the Dotted magazine on the theme, Mainstreaming Social and Emotional Learning. I take immense pleasure in welcoming Dr. Stephanie Jones. Dr. Stephanie is Gerald S. Lesser Professor in Early Childhood Development at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, Harvard University, United States. Dr. Jones' research, anchored in prevention science, focuses on effects of poverty and exposure to violence on children and youth social, emotional, and behavioral development. Over the last decade, her work has focused on evaluation research, addressing the impact of preschool and elementary focused social emotional learning interventions on behavioral and academic outcomes and classroom practices, as well as new curriculum development, implementation, and testing. I take great pleasure in welcoming Dr. Sue Roffey. Dr. Sue is a psychologist, academic speaker, and author on school and social and student well-being. She's an author, and currently she's an honorary associate professor at University College of London and Western Sydney Universities. Additionally, Dr. Sue is the director of Growing Great Schools Worldwide, United Kingdom. Dr. Sue has developed a pedagogy for social and emotional learning to shape a safe, strengths and solutions focused space for students and teachers. It is my delight and pleasure to welcome Dr. Ashok K. Pandey. Dr. Pandey is the chairperson of the Council for Global Citizenship Education and director of Alcon Group of Schools, India. He is the recipient of the National Teachers Award by the President of India in 2012 and the Lifetime Achievement Award by Ferguson Humanitarian Foundation International, United States. Dr. Pandey sits on the governing body of the National Council for Teacher Education, NCTE India. He's presently the coordinator for climate education at Climate Reality Project India and national partner for United Nations Act for SDG campaign. I take great pleasure in welcoming our very own David Adams. David Adams is the CEO at the Urban Assembly United States. He's previously served as the SEL coordinator for District 75 in New York City, where he shaped the SEL approach for students with severe cognitive and behavioral challenges. Now, as we continue to live in an increasingly challenging and uncertain time.
Aaryan, we can see Dr. Haynes. He is there. Dr. Norris Haynes.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, sir. And I take great pleasure in welcoming Dr. Norris M. Haynes. Dr. Haynes is a professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at the Southern Connecticut State University, United States, where he founded and directed the Center for Community and School Action Research. He has served as the chairperson of the Counseling and School Psychology Department at the university. Also, Dr. Haynes is the author of many peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and monographs. A very warm welcome to all the panelists. Now we'll get into the ceremony to mark a moment of silence. So as we all continue to live in increasingly challenging and uncertain times with enormous changes and disruptions to our lives and our professions, it is a moment for us to assume active global citizenship and support those in need. Having said that, I would like to take this moment to mark a minute of silence for those who have lost their lives to the pandemic, the grieving individuals, the families, and in solidarity with academics and educational leaders in conflict zones, including Afghanistan, Syria, and Yemen. Thank you. Now we ring the bell to thank and honor our educators and others on the front line who carry out essential roles selflessly, continuing their day-to-day duties inside and outside the home in support of us all. Thank you. Before we formally proceed to the panel discussion, it is a great pleasure to announce that we are launching the second edition of the Dotted magazine with a theme focusing on mainstreaming social and emotional learning. So if we can virtually inaugurate, that would be good. So thank you everyone for your amazing contribution. So we have the authors here and the guest editor. So with my deepest gratitude to all our supporters, our contributors, the editorial committee, and all of you who have been supporting us all throughout. So a special thank you to all of you. So we'll proceed to the panel discussion in a moment. So let me introduce the panel topic to all of you. The Online Educational Leadership Forum was started to provide a platform for educational leaders to shape, empower, influence, and advance the discourse on, and be a springboard aiding action towards transforming education for human flourishing. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, the mental health challenges amongst young people and the rising extremism and xenophobia were increasingly seen as a global challenge. In today's crisis situation, with the rise of political and ideological extremism and a dramatic increase in the mental health problems experienced by young people, it is becoming more and more important to advocate for and mainstream social emotional learning, or SEL as it is known, to support children, young people, and adults to acquire and effectively apply the knowledge, attitude, and skills necessary to recognize and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, develop empathy and compassion for others, build positive relations, and make informed decisions as responsible global citizens. The COVID-19 situation has only exacerbated and affected more learners and educators around the world as we're getting into this new normal of social distancing and online or blended learning models. The positive influences of SEL on young people's academic performance, well-being, and this future success have been found in evidence-based research. It is a pivotal moment for all of us as educational stakeholders to explore the significance of SEL and its potential for the construction of a more equal, inclusive, and cohesive global community. The good news is that more and more educators and educational institutions are recognizing the need for SEL and are exploring ways to foster it in these times. While we recognize that there is no one size fits all SEL model, program, or approach that is suitable to all students and educators across the world, the positive influences of SEL on children and young people's academic performance, well-being, and their journey after leaving education are found in different educational contexts around the world. If implemented incorrectly, it could be ineffective and at worst do more harm than good. So we believe this panel will shed a light on the challenges, opportunities, relevance, myths, innovation, strategies, and approaches to fostering social and emotional learning for student success. So our goal today is, whatever your role is in the education sector, that you'll come away with something, a fresh perspective, a new idea, a new strategy that you can apply to be more successful at what you're doing best, while ensuring that the much needed continuous professional development is attained to transform education for human flourishing. Now, I open the floor to the panel discussion by requesting Dr. Stephanie to make her initial remarks.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here. I'm honored to be in this group of esteemed colleagues who care as much as I do about this really important world of social and emotional learning. And I'm just going to say a few things, and I'm going to time myself because I sometimes can't control myself, and I want to say so many things and I can't stop. So I will watch the clock. I really have 4 things to say about SEL. And I'll start by saying I am a developmental psychologist, so I always think about human development when I'm talking about social and emotional learning. And that's really the first thing I want to say about SEL, which is that the skills and competencies are multifaceted and they are developmental. They grow and change over time. And what's important and salient at different various developmental stages changes over time, which should change how we focus and support those skills. The second thing I want to say about social emotional learning is that these skills are malleable, meaning there are effective strategies, practices, and programs that make a difference. And there are examples of these all over the world. There are 2 key things, though, about practice that we've learned in our group, and I think that are shared across this panel. The first is, when you look across the most studied and implemented programs, there are a smaller number of common effective strategies. And these are really 4 things. The first is modeling, so adults living and engaging in the skills that they hope to see in young people. Teaching, so teaching skills directly and explicitly. Practicing, providing lots of opportunities to practice skills as they grow and develop. And then having a language of social and emotional skills all throughout whatever setting it is, in the home, in the school, in the community. The second thing about practice I wanted to share is that SEL practices are especially effective. Indeed, they are the most effective set of strategies we have available to us to interrupt that stress response system and support children and adults to manage and then bounce back from traumatic, chaotic, and disruptive experiences. This brings me to my third point, which is related to that. As we consider what we've all been through all around the world, experiencing COVID and its impact on children and families, and especially as we think about this return to school and the process of being back in school in some parts of the world and still yet to return in others. We know that children's academic learning, their social, emotional, and their behavioral skills and their mental health have been significantly challenged. There are lots of studies emerging around the globe about this. What I think is less clear so far is that SEL strategies are an essential response to this disruption. I hear a lot of legitimate worry about learning loss, but I think if we jump to those areas without addressing children's and adults' social and emotional needs, we may cause more trouble. If we start by addressing children's social and emotional needs, I think we'll accelerate those gains, those regains in learning. So it's important to remember that these areas are closely entwined. They're complements to each other, not in competition with each other. And here's my last point. As we look to this idea, which is on everybody's mind, about sort of sharing effective strategies and scaling them, my hope is that we'll think about how we can simplify and localize, which means maybe identifying the essential elements to any effective program or practice, and then consider what it might mean and look like in a local context. So when we're thinking about what goes to scale, we're thinking about the kind of core active ingredients, while at the same time making those resonant and relevant in a local setting. Those are my 4 big ideas about SEL, and I'll turn it to the next person.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. I request Dr. Haynes.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you this morning. I joined Dr. Jones in really congratulating the committee for putting this wonderful forum together. This is very important work, and I think that approaching this in a very global international perspective is very important, and I think it's very significant work. So thank you very much for the opportunity. There are a couple of things I'd like to say that inform my thinking about SEL and its work across the globe. First, the neuroscientific basis or biological basis of SEL, I think, has proven to be pretty strong, although I think there's more work to be done. We are learning more about the cognition-emotions connection and how that occurs within the brain. And I think continuing to advance our understanding of that could be translational in terms of how we take that information and that knowledge and impact how we implement SEL strategies and how we approach the teaching of SEL in schools and in other settings outside of school. And in making that point, I want to also emphasize the outside of school aspect of SEL. Because many of us are educators, we have thought of SEL as often as an in-school approach to helping kids develop well, young people develop well. But I think that we also need to continue to recognize the value of SEL in the home, in other settings where children and adults interact on a regular basis. So I just wanted to make that point. I want to also reflect Dr. Jones's developmental perspective. Social and emotional learning begins almost at birth, really. And Professor Jones is the developmental psychologist, so has more expertise in the developmental aspects than I do. But certainly, SEL, the skills that we are trying to teach or that we teach in SEL really covers the entire lifespan. And so I think we may think of SEL in sort of time confined space and space confined situations in school, in certain grade levels and so on. But remember that the students we teach have had continued to develop, and some of them have had many years of development prior to where we interact with them. And so we should be informed by development as we think about how we introduce and implement SEL in a very, very developmental way. So I think that's very important. And then just a couple more things I'd like to mention. Connected to this issue of development, I think is looking at studies in a more longitudinal way. We've had quite a few studies that look at social emotional learning, but not very many of them are longitudinal studies. And so I think it's one of the things that I have a keen interest in going forward is looking at how these SEL competencies, as I prefer to call them, rather than skills, but these competencies, how do they translate into longitudinal and lifetime benefits, if you will, over the lifespan? And so I think more research in that area would help us quite a lot. And I'll come back to some of these other points that I'd like to make as the panel progresses. But let me just make one other point. I am keenly interested in looking at disaggregated impact of SEL teaching and learning. And by that, I mean looking at things like race and ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic demographics. What are the differential, if any, impact of SEL as we look at these different populations within society? And what can we learn about the influence of SEL? And in doing so, think about the definition of what SEL is, right? We've had interventions with children and with adults for as long as we can remember, right? Many of these have addressed behaviors and how people feel and how people manage their emotions. But what is it that makes SEL SEL? How does SEL come together to be defined as a body of study, as a body of work? And so we have these 5 core competencies. Is an SEL program one that includes one competency, all 5 of them? CASTLE, I think, the Collaborative Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, I think attempts to answer this question when it put together this compendium of programs and the evaluation of these programs. But there's still an issue of definition and clarification of what SEL is and how do these 5 core competencies, how are they configured in our thinking about what is truly an SEL program. There's some other things I'd like to say, but I'll pause now and then I'll come back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haynes. Dr. Sue, if you may please have the floor.
Hi, first of all, I'd like to say a big thank you for the work that you are all doing, and I'm very honoured to be part of this panel today. I've got quite a lot to say, so I'll try and stick to those five minutes, and thanks for what people have already said. My first ever job was with young people, teaching young people with social, emotional and behavioural difficulties. And most of my writing around student and school wellbeing is been about behaviour. And I do have a bit of a passion about what happens for what I call our double whammy kids, those youngsters who experience adverse childhood experiences and then go to school and quite often can't learn well, can't concentrate, don't make friends easily, and quite often get rejected from school. And we can see that all over the place, and it is just unacceptable to me. So social and emotional learning in schools has become allied for me with social justice, because I can't see anything better than having social and emotional learning regularly in a classroom, because it changes school culture, it changes school climate, and it changes the acceptance of those young people. In 2009, Catherine Eccleston and Dennis Hayes wrote a book called The Dangerous Rise of Therapeutic Education. And they were talking about how unsafe it was, not only for children talking about their feelings, but also for teachers who didn't know what to do if suddenly Pandora's box was opened and all sorts of things came out. They didn't know how to deal with that. And although I absolutely thought that they threw the baby out with the bathwater, I think they had a point. And really, since then, with the work that I've been doing around circle solutions and the Aspire principles and pedagogy, I've been looking at not just what you do, and I have developed 12 dimensions of social emotional learning, which some of it mirrors Cassell, but some of it breaks some of the Cassell things up into different bits. But it's also about perceptions and attitudes and understandings, not just about skills. So for me, that's actually really important. It's just not just skills, but developing a framework for implementation, a framework that's strengths and solution focus. And the acronym for that is ASPIRE. And A stands for agency. So you don't tell children what's right, you actually give them activities in which they are expected to reflect and discuss and come to their own conclusions. And with other people, they'll come to the conclusions, by and large, that you want them to have. Actually, that's been my experience. When I've been working with Aboriginal students, that's some of the things about implementation has been really, really important, because we need to have things that are culturally sensitive. The S stands for safety, and safety is about making sure that we are not talking about incidents in children's lives, but talking about issues that they're dealing with. And we also give them the opportunity to not speak if they don't want to. And I think that that has really been a safety valve, particularly for some of our young people. It's really difficult for some of our young people to speak unless they feel it's a safe place for them to talk. So the activities you give are very indirect. I've done away with the word I and me a lot in the work that I do to introduce we or someone, because that makes it a little bit safer for everybody to talk about things. So safety is the S. The P is for positivity, which means that you're not talking about the difficulties, you're talking about solutions, and you're helping young people identify not only their own strengths, but strengths for other people. I did a TED talk a few years ago, which was called School as Family. It was TEDx, not just TEDx talk. And it's very much about, and I think this will fit in what people have already said about developmental issues. It's about making sure that school fits in with what we know is healthy development. And I don't know about you, but what's happened to enjoyment and play and all the things that, you know, our kids need in their lives to develop well. So a lot of the activities in the Circle Solutions work that I do is just to have a good time together, you know, to laugh, to produce that oxytocin, to have fun and feel connected. The I is for inclusion. All the time you're mixing people up, so they talk to people outside their usual social circles, and you give people an opportunity to tell their stories if they want to and if they feel comfortable doing it. It's not acceptable in circles to refuse to sit next to somebody else. So you play games so that people do not go and immediately sit next to their mates. They mix people up. And the facilitators, teachers, join in with everything that the students do, so they get to know the kids in their class in a different sort of way. And that makes a big difference. It's not teachers saying, being too directional, it's modelling. And I think people have already mentioned the importance of modelling and showing kids what to do and how to do it, and doing it all the time. So important, that modelling. The R is for respect, and that's for listening to each other. It's not prejudging people. It's respect, not just for individuals, but also for culture. And with my colleague Brenda Dobio, we wrote a chapter for a book recently, 2 or 3 years ago now probably, called Respect for Culture, social emotional learning in Australia and the Asia Pacific. And I think that was just really important. It's based on very much on our work with Aboriginal communities and the importance of giving people that space, making them feel connected with each other. And the final one is E in Aspire for equity. Now, it used to be equality because we know that well-being is based very much in equality, but equality is treating everybody all the same, and equity is actually about being flexible and knowing that some people need more support and something additional or different from other people. I'm hoping that we might have an opportunity to unpick some of that in the panel, but that's an overview of an implementation framework that we now have found in a number of circumstances, a number of research studies, is actually making a difference. And one of the things that's the biggest one for me is that the young people across the world who are doing circle solutions and using the Aspire principles, they're coming up to their teachers and saying, can we do it? Can we do it? We want to do it. We like doing it. And even those youngsters whose behaviour is a bit challenging outside circles want to do circles because they know that they benefit from what they're doing. They're learning about themselves and they're learning about other people.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sue. Dr. Pandey, if you may please take the floor.
Thank you, Aaryan, for offering me a seat among these distinguished panelists. I'm already enriched a lot. The three preceding speakers have created three big stories around SEL. And therefore, I think all I had to do is that share a bit of my interpretation and my understanding of what they have said. And I think that is the safest bet for me. So the first thing is the developmental part. I think it is so important from our perspective also. Dr. Stephanie mentioned about that it has to be contextualized and it has to be localized. And therefore, in our context and localization, I must bring about the four developmental aspects that we talk about all the time. And they are physical, mental, spiritual, and socio-emotional development. And socio-emotional development have been talked about by many schools of thought by different names, as simple as getting connected, as simple as being a good friend, being good to others, and also how you treat people and how you get treated. So all these aspects of socio-emotional learning, in my opinion, they boil down to what I call interpersonal relationship, empathy, communication, creativity, cooperation, and manifestation of a beautiful human relationship. And that is what it is all about. And therefore, in that paradigm of development, as we talk about, the children begin their life cycle with a lot of dependency, and they crave for being independent as they move up. And finally, we have to bring it around to them that independency could be a need on the developmental cycle, but that's not the end ambition. The end ambition is in the form of aspire, which Dr. Sue is talking about, right? And therefore, at this stage, let me only tell you that that means interdependence. And I think it is the interdependency of relationship that builds the whole cycle of socio-emotional learning. And therefore, learning from what Dr. Sue was saying, so two or three scenarios emerge here. Scenario number one is that we have two different approaches. And therefore, can we reach out to each other and propose that, look, our approaches are different? Can we sit together and can we talk it out, right? And can we find out a scenario which is good to both of us or good to all of us? The second one is the respect that she talked about, that is respectfully listening, right? And listening to understand each other's point of view and not listening to reply back, right? And therefore, out of these two scenarios, we come to a third scenario that we are finding an alternative solution, which is co-owned by all the interlocutors, and it is not attributed to just one of them and leading to discontent or whatever it is. And therefore, in my opinion, the last thing, which is lasting in my opinion, is that at the core of SEL is collaboration, interdependence, and service. Service is so important, working together, and you see, if we are socio-emotionally strong, that brings intrinsic securities and safeties, which Dr. Sue was talking about. And I think at the core of this intrinsic safety is the attitude of service. Somebody has very rightly said that service is the rent that all of us have to pay for living on this planet. And I think that is the big picture that we have to show to our students. So at this stage, I'm stopping here, Aaryan. Maybe we can talk about it a little later.
Thank you so much for that one, Dr. Pandey. David, if you may please take the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Aaryan. Thank you to our esteemed panelists. I'm very excited to be here. If I may just take a moment to recognize the passing of Dr. Roger Weisberg, who is the founder of Castle and a giant in our field in terms of social and emotional learning. He passed recently, and want to pay respects as he moves on and recognize that his legacy is living here today, not just on this panel, but across the world. So I just want to publicly thank Dr. Weisberg for his contributions, his legacy to the field of social and emotional learning. And as we think a little bit about this notion of energy and how energy is created and what role social and emotional learning plays in creating energy, it takes me back to the conversation that I contributed to this most recent edition. And the conversation I had in the piece was really focused on this idea that energy is something that needs to be ordered, right? The concept of entropy is one that talks about this idea that societies, the universe itself, actually moves from an order to a disordered state. It moves from a place of structure, a place of meaning, to a place of meaninglessness. And at first, I got a little bit cynical. I felt overwhelmed by that idea that the universe is really against us, that society moves to atomization, that lives move from meaning to unmeaning. But then looking more deeply into this idea, it turns out there's one thing that we can do to slow this movement towards entropy, this movement towards disorder, disorganization, and that is apply energy towards creating and sustaining structure. And so when we think about the role of education, and when we think about the role of social and emotional learning, we recognize that it gives our societies the energy to apply to maintaining the kinds of structures that allow us to pursue the common good. And so, Aaryan, I moved from this place where I was feeling a little cynical. I was feeling a little disheartened because the universe itself is against this notion of how we are organized, that everything moves from structure to unstructure. But then I realized this second piece, right? That if we can channel our energies effectively, if we can create and maintain structures and frameworks that allow us to stave off this process, then we can hold this moment, that we can hold this space, and our societies can navigate that common good. So now I talked to my wife about this, Aaryan, and she said, this reminds me of the house, because it takes no energy for the house to get all crazy, but it takes a lot of energy to organize it. If you go out and see a couple of kids running around in the soccer field or playing basketball, again, it takes no energy for them to do their own thing, but it takes energy to develop how they work as a team. And our societies are the same way. We are living in multicultural, multi-ethnic societies that are increasing in the diversity. And so what social and emotional learning happens or gives to us are three things. One is that it names, and Dr. Jones talked about this with regards to the language of SEL skills. It names the kinds of places that our energy should be focused on, right? Active listening, Dr. Pandey talked about. How do we collaborate effectively? How do we pursue community? Secondly, what social and emotional learning does for us is it gives us the energy to have these challenges organized in ways that focus on the common good, right? It tells us that disorder is not our fault. Disorder is not something that Aaryan did or David did or Dr. Jones did. It is, in fact, the default state of how our societies operate. It is the default state of who we are. So the challenge is not to create less disorder. It is to create order through energy. And that is where our social and emotional skills will come to place. And that is where education is so important. And the last thing is to recognize where spaces of disorder are going to be helpful. Diversity, markets, these things all increase the amount of disorder in society, but if channeled effectively, it can pursue and navigate a common good. So as we're looking at social and emotional learning, as we're looking at education, I hope that we recognize that the work that we are doing is to create these spaces of clarity, to create these spaces of structure so that we can continue to evolve as a people. And I'm just going to quote here Steven Pinker as he talks about this. He says that the second law, he's talking about entropy, defines the ultimate purpose of life, mind, and human striving: to deploy energy and information to fight back the tide of entropy and to carve out refuges of beneficial order. An underappreciation of the inherent tendency towards disorder and a failure to appreciate the precious niches of order that we carve out are major sources of human folly. So as I leave it back to the panel, Aaryan, I just want us to recognize that these are our energies, these are our legacies, these are the places to devote our passions, to maintain the order for the common good, to have a global citizenship, and to continue to view social and emotional learning in all that we do.
Thank you, David, for your thoughts, and thank you, everybody. Now we'll move on to the next stage of the panel discussion. So I would request David, if you can ask one question to any of the other panelists.
Sure, I will start out with Dr. Jones. Dr. Jones, you talked about modeling, teaching, practicing, and the language of SEL skills. Dr. Haynes and Dr. Roffey raised up this concern around a common language and a common definition. So given the discrepancy around having a common definition, I know you'll work around frameworks, how can we create language if we haven't decided on what that language should be?
That's a great question. Let's see what my answer is. So I think there are multiple things at play in that question. And as you mentioned, I've been in a certain way obsessed with the language of SEL over the last number of years, and the vast number of frameworks that characterize, that honor, that value the field. And I started early on thinking like we needed to get to one language of SEL, and I've moved over time to something else completely, which is that we need to value all of the perspectives on what SEL is. And what we actually have to work to do is to figure out how to talk across them and to each other about them. Because all of these viewpoints are essentially located in community values, right? So if we tried to get to one common language, we wouldn't be honoring what is important to those who are doing the work. So that's one thing. And I put in the chat this website that we designed that's intended to bring together that conversation about frameworks. So I think that's one part of it. The other part is like, what are the common practices that support those varied skills? And that's what I was highlighting in the kind of model, teach, practice, discuss. Those things feel to me, and I might be wrong about this, is sort of a universal set of ways to interact and engage around these varied topics that are under this vast umbrella of social and emotional learning. So what we discuss can be highly localized, like the words we use should be the words that come from the place and the people. But that we talk about them is what's important. So what am I supposed to do next? Do I turn the question to someone else?
Stephanie, yes.
I would like others to weigh in. I love the question, but I can also ask a new question. Is that what it is?
Sure, Dr. Stephanie.
Okay, I'll ask a new question, but it's related to that question. And I was going to ask this question of David just because I know about a project he's just started related to this, but I'm going to actually direct it to Sue because I think it's relevant to everyone. So we have this multifaceted language of SEL that we value. We might have common practices, but what about data? Like, how do we then engage in careful and systematic learning about the practices that we're engaged in? If we have this varied language of SEL, how do we gather information to monitor, to know about what we're doing?
I think that's an interesting question, and what you're doing is you're talking basically to a qualitative researcher. So I'm probably going to come back with other questions, because, you know, yes, it's important to know how effective you are being in what you're doing, but I also think it's equally important to know what meanings that has for the people who are engaged in it. And I think we need a combination of both, because if we don't have a combination of both, and I don't know about you, but I have filled in many surveys when I've got to a question and I thought it's not appropriate, or it depends, or something. So I feel that, you know, a lot of people in this field think that they're being objective when they're doing things like that. I think it's all subjective. So I think we need to honour the subjectivity of it, and go round and sort of say to people, okay, so what did this mean for you? Be open about it and actually get much more information. In what ways did this programme reduce your feeling of antagonism towards this group or that group, you know? Stuff I've been interested recently in things like toxic masculinity, you know, what activities might we do, and what do those activities mean for those young people, those boys, to actually shift their understandings about how they are in relationship to other people. And they might say it's made me think differently about the porn that I watch, for instance, because I think that those sorts of things, information is phenomenally important to know that what we're doing has an impact. Why would we do it if it doesn't have an impact? But I think it needs to be broad-based across both meaning and measurement.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sue. Dr. Sue, if you could please ask one question to any of the panelists.
Yes. I mean, I've got lots of questions, and what an opportunity to have all these people sitting in front of me, you know. But I am living at the moment in England. I lived in Australia for a long time, but I'm now based in London. And what we have is an education government department who are deeply disinterested in anything to do with learning to be and learning to live together. They are, there's a number of schools who are very concerned about the well-being of our young people, but it's all about looking at individual children and saying, you've got a mental health problem and we need to get you to see somebody about it, rather than what sorts of things promote well-being, what sorts of things undermine healthy communities and healthy societies. What we need, all the work that I've done, is about how do we promote a shared humanity, and we have a government who is deeply, deeply disinterested in a shared humanity. So I'd like to ask Dr. Ashok, if you wouldn't mind, because you are doing things at a global level, how do we move into policy decisions that are going to put social and emotional learning much more firmly on the agenda in education?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sue, for bringing me in. And I'm very, very passionate about what you, named as shared humanity. And at the Council for Global Citizenship Development and the Council for Sustainable Developmental Goals, we are constantly engaged in creating a regenerative society, where we are able to build a society which not only sustains, we have been talking about sustainability, we are talking of a society which thrives. And I think the foundational principles of that thriving society is what you have already mentioned. And you talked about inclusion, diversity, respecting each other. So how do we do this? And that is what we are saying, that let us build it right from the early years on. And let us not wait for it to develop on itself, or to develop it automatically when the children grow up. That's not going to happen. And therefore, I bring in here some of the cautionary points. So one caution point is what we call the self-fulfilling prophecies. And we were talking about data on research. And I just quickly, Aaryan, if you permit me, one quick research I bring in, where a computer was incorrectly coded, and where it marked the very bright children as dull children and the dull children as very bright children, right? And then they taught for 5 6 months on this basis, and suddenly the computer department recognized that there is a mistake. And then they said, okay, let us not fix the mistake. Let us see what has happened. And then they found that the bright children, which were branded as average, they actually turned out to be averages, because this is what the prophecy of the teachers was. On the other hand, those children which were branded as bright and they were actually average, the teachers, their learning deficiency, they took it as a teaching deficiency, and they overcame their inflexibilities and made a lot of changes to do that. So the idea is that how we overcome our own prejudices, and how we bring in, I think one of the panelists brought out here, SEL as a social justice phenomenon. I think that is the root from where some beginning could be made.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Pandey. If you may please ask one question.
Yeah, I have a question ready for Dr. Norris, and it is a response to some of the questions he left us with, and then I'm bringing a question out of that. Dr. Norris, if I understood correctly, you were trying to say that there is a lack of longitudinal study to establish that socio-emotional learning or socio-emotional skill building is actually good for human beings. If that is the hypothesis, only two things I want to bring in here. Of course, I mean, there was a study on the 500 top fortune companies and their CEOs and what is the common quality that dictates them. And it was found that humility was on top of it, right? And not projecting yourself was the second one. And the third one was investing in people. I have a feeling that all these emanate from your social emotional skills. This is one thing. And the second thing is a latest study of the McKinsey Global Institute. And the top two is future skills that they have established. One of them is three, in fact: higher cognitive skills, socio-emotional skills, and digital skills. So these are the skills which are going to be in demand for a sustainable growth of the society. So if these studies, you think that they fulfill the gap that you are hinting at, or you're looking for something else?
Dr. Haynes, you're on mute. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Dr. Pandey, for that question. I think these studies are very important. Daniel Goleman and his colleagues also have looked at, and I think some of these studies reflect some of that work, that the most successful executives, business people are, as you said, those people who have those characteristics. But I do feel that we have done quite a bit in looking at cross-sectional studies in schools, particularly in schools, but sometimes outside of school. But we have not done enough in looking at students who have been exposed to SEL, curricular and add-on programs after school and so on, how they have continued to grow and develop socially and emotionally. And things like graduation rates. If these students enter college, how do they do? Do they drop out? Do they continue to do well? Do they graduate from college? Do they go on and get employed and so on? So I think more of these kinds of studies, I think, would be helpful. I think there are a couple of them, but I don't think we have enough. And maybe that's because of the how young this field is compared to other fields. But I do think that these studies are relevant. I think they help us to understand the impact of SEL, particularly the attributes that you've described with respect to adult success. I do want to advocate for more of these studies looking at children and youth, and then following groups of samples across time, over time.
Thank you, Dr. Norris.
Thank you for that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Norris, Dr. Pandey, Dr. Sue.
Aaryan, Dr. Norris may like to ask some question to someone.
Yes, Dr. Pandey.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Pandey. Well, I wanted to David, Dr. Adams, I wanted to reflect and support and endorse Dr. Adams's recognition of Roger Weisberg, who has had such a major impact on this field. I remember, as a postdoctoral fellow at Yale, sitting in Dr. Weisberg's class on SEL. It was the first SEL class that I took. And one of the things that really came across very strongly from Professor Weisberg was his commitment to this field, but also his humility, and his dedication to service. So I want to ask Dr. Adams, as you reflect on Professor Weisberg's work and the work of Castle, what do you see as the new direction, if you will, or another direction, or continuing direction as the next major step forward for this work in terms of its impact globally?
Well, thank you, Dr. Haynes, for the question. For full disclosure, I do sit on the board of Castle, so I do have influence around that direction. And I think it's reflective of the things that you had talked about. I think we're at a place where the concepts and the constructs that underlie social and emotional learning have been relatively widely applied to everything from mindfulness to things like social skill development to things like yoga. And I think all of these things have a place in the idea of social and emotional learning. And as we kind of refine and define what is social and emotional learning, what are the attributes, and I know Dr. Jones has been spending a lot of time doing this. I think the key things are to really differentiate between the words that we use insofar as how we describe things and the research that underlies it. I think there's been a movement in the field of SEL in which we've really focused on kind of the face validity. Does this word make me feel good about the definition of social emotional learning? Does this construct make me feel confident? Rather than saying, what is the research behind this idea? And to your point, how does it predict things that we care about? So I would answer this in terms of Dr. Weisberg and his passing. I think his legacy has been to ground the field of social and emotional learning in a research base that allows us to say self-management matters, not because I think it matters or you think it matters, because it predicts important things. Social awareness matters because it predicts important things about ourselves and our society. And to the extent that we continue to refine that language, to refine that research, I think we'll be able to come together through a common lens around our research base. And that's going to help remove some of the atomization that we've seen in the field so far.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Haynes, for the question, and thank you, David, for answering. So we'll straight up proceed to the next round. So here I have a few questions for all our panelists. However, I would also like the audience to respond in the chat box, right? So one of the questions that I have is, while we have been focusing on fostering SEL amongst learners, what are the things, or who are the people we are missing to focus on as we get into implementing SEL or talk about fostering SEL? So my question is to Dr. Stephanie.
So I have so many things to say. As Dr. Sue said, I have a lot of things that I could say in response to or to build on, or to add to what everybody has said. So I'm exerting some measure of self-regulation here, which is one of those key SEL skills. So I think that we have struggled in this field with a tendency to make assumptions about who's supposed to have SEL skills and who doesn't. And I think we spend a lot of time talking about social emotional skills and competencies, attitudes, habits, values, whatever, what have you, in terms of what children have or don't have. And I think we need to really reframe that conversation, and it's rooted in the language we use. I use it all the time, so I am definitely part of the problem. I think we have to step back and talk about an ecology of individuals who are in connections with each other, and the features and characteristics of settings that foster or impede the kinds of things that just happen as part of human development. And so for the field of SEL to become richer and more relevant, we need to push it, to think hard, to generate a lexicon around conditions and settings, networks and interactions, as opposed to individual characteristics and traits, because that still is out there as a big component of SEL. So that's what I would offer.
Thank you so much for that one, Dr. Stephanie. David, my question is for you. Designing SEL plans or designing lesson plans on SEL can be challenging. So what are the pitfalls that one should avoid as they get into designing either a strategy for their school or designing a lesson plan? So
Thank you, Aaryan. So I'm going to answer that question as well as respectfully push back a little bit on Dr. Jones' assertion here. I think that the relationship between the environment, the interactions, and individual and social emotional development is very, very important. It's been talked about a lot through the Aspen Institute, through University of Chicago. But I think the programs that develop individual skills are important as well. And so I would nuance this to say that both skill development, individual traits, and interactional developments with regards to the environment, we need to have a lexicon that articulates both who we are and how we develop and employ our SEL skills, as well as the environments that develop them. So if that's okay, Dr. Jones, I'd just like to nuance that. With regards to pitfalls, Aaryan, I think the idea here is the importance of practice. I would say the most important pitfall is this idea that social and emotional learning is mostly a knowledge basis rather than a skill or competency that can be practiced, internalized, and developed. The language that we use creates the construct that helps students to reason, because we reason through language. But the actual development is through the interactions in the person to person, teacher to the students. So I would say the major pitfall is when folks talk about, and Dr. Jones said this student lacks self-regulation. We all have self-regulation. We may not be activating it in the context of the environment. We may need support in displaying it in stressful situations. It's both a developmental piece as well as a skill piece. And so we're right now overly focused on really unidimensional understanding of social and emotional learning rather than mixing the complexity of what it means to be able to identify, regulate your emotions in the context of a difficult situation.
Thank you so much for your response, David. My next question is to Dr. Pandey. Though this was Dr. Stephanie who spoke about localizing SEL and simplifying SEL. Dr. Pandey, how do you see that happening in the context of developing countries, right? So how do you see SEL being localized and SEL being simplified to be effective?
Yeah, so let me put here two things. The SEL is nested in communities, right? Now, those communities will give you the culture and its lexicon, which Dr. Stephanie talked about, and David has also supported it. But we have to extend it. Now, the communities are extending, they are expanding. And earlier, Dr. Sue asked about it. We have to see the whole world as a community. But then, are you going to develop a lexicon for the whole world in the first place, or you'll develop your lexicon locally, right? So that's the decision we have to take. The second thing, which is very, very important here, is that we have to, right from the beginning, tell our children that you are part of the community, not only that you are part of the family or you are part of your parents. That's given. Nobody is going to question that. But the moment we extend it to community, then the children will start seeing their happiness and their fulfillment in being a part of the community, in doing a celebrated project for the community, in doing incredible things for the community, and not only in winning high percentile of marks for themselves and for their parents. I think that is one thing very clearly we have to bring, right? The second thing that we have to do is, and which will again come from the locality and the culture of that locale is that all of us, all of us are product of somebody in the community who wrote a script for us, who valued us, who made us feel important, who gave their shoulders for us to lean on. And therefore, we have to tell our children that you be the script writer for somebody else, right? So I think this is the kind of narrative that we have to bring in our curriculum, in our pedagogy. And many of our panelists use the word modeling, storytelling, anecdotal references. I think those are the things that we have to bring in.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your response, Dr. Pandey. Dr. Haynes, my question is to you. So when you look at SEL before the pandemic, so we had a community, we had a face-to-face interaction. So we had a certain level of comfort when we're interacting and engaging. So how do you see this being affected, and what could educators do to counter the flaws or flip sides of engaging online?
Well, I think online forums certainly, and this is an online forum, and certainly, this is a very positive and impactful experience. So I think that online forums certainly could be designed to be extremely helpful and beneficial from an SEL perspective. Now, if it's okay for me to share that I am working with a group of startup, technology wizards. Actually, they are much younger than I am, and they know much about technology than I do. But this is a group that's called Carousel, and they've asked me to work with them as an advisor, as they develop this platform to bring SEL to students on their cell phones, on their laptops. They can interact digitally. They can interact with their parents in the home environment. But they're engaged in SEL on an ongoing, continuous basis. And what this platform does, not only does it have structured SEL lessons and some unstructured, but it also has the opportunity for ongoing SEL assessments that are built in, so that students and children and adults can assess themselves and move from one level to another based on the feedback that they get immediately from this digital app. So I think that Carousel, the group that I'm working with, is one example of how we could use digital technology to address some of the limitations that have been imposed by the pandemic, and it allows us to be creative, while at the same time continuing to assess and develop the skills that we want and the competencies that we want young people and adults to continue to develop and to have.
Thank you for your response, Dr. Haynes. My final question is to Dr. Sue. Dr. Sue, generally when we see SEL models, there are quite a few models when we look at it. In fact, what Dr. Stephanie was talking about when she spoke about Explore SEL was the plethora of models that are available already. So how do you measure whether a model works in a particular context or not? How do you see whether it works or not? How could educators make that choice?
I think that's a really interesting question, and in lots of ways it mirrors the question that Stephanie was asking about making sure that we know that something is working or not. And I think that we have to be able. I mean, if I was going to be doing something like this, I would be having all young people sitting around in a circle, talking to each other around specific questions and finding out what they thought, and then sharing that with everybody to see whether or not things were being effective or not. I think we are I think we get ourselves into a difficult situation if it's the adults in the room who are saying, this is the behavior I want to see, this is the character quality that I think is a good one, because things like American culture actually says that competition and getting to the top and being a success is what we are looking for. It's what we should be encouraging our children to aim for. That's not the same in other cultures, and we need to be much more culturally sensitive to those sorts of things. And people are also not talking enough, I think, about the important terminology of becoming. We're talking about being, are you there or you're not there, but actually that whole issue about whether or not people are becoming more understanding of other people and what that means and what that looks like. So for me, it's not about other people making that assessment. And somebody said, I think it might have been David, talking about young people having a way of self-assessing, or maybe it was Dr. Norris, about self-assessing, actually looking at themselves. If you do that, then you've not got kids who are thinking that they're a failure. If they're a failure, there's lots and lots of kids who think they're failures in school because they're not academic stars, right? And we absolutely do not want to have that situation in schools where there's young people thinking that they're also failures when it comes to social and emotional learning. We have to avoid that. We have to make them understand that it's actually about not just development of skills and competencies, but there's different stages. Number one, if they were looking at themselves, it might be number one, they have no idea about something, or they have very, very low self-esteem. And number five might think that they have high self-esteem and they're also promoting other people's. And four is, they have high self-esteem, but they're actually very narcissistic, which is not what we want to see. I think what we're talking about is complex, and I think it's really good to have these forums in which we can unpick some of those complexities.
If I may, and I don't mean to speak out of turn, but I just wanted to endorse something that Professor Roffey just said. I think that it's so important to be able to allow young people to understand that if they are not able to master a competency, it doesn't mean that they're a failure, and that they can continue to work. It's almost it's akin to Carol Dweck's growth mindset. One of the things that Carousel does, and the SEL in Carousel, is social emotional learning. So it's a play on the term social emotional learning. But one of the things that it does, it does exactly what Professor Roffey just said, which is you give the feedback to the individual and to the child, and then the child is able to make the adjustment needed to go to the next level, and then experience success by being able to move forward after getting that feedback. So I think that's very important, so I just want to thank you for making that point.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haynes. So now we move on to the audience question. We have about 10 minutes, so please excuse me if I'm missing out some of your questions. So I'll be picking up a few questions from here. So we have one, Dr. Sumant Kulshester. So he has asked this question. I would like to understand, how can we ensure implementation of SEL in digital era, as nothing can replace human touch? I think we've tried covering this. If anyone would like to, from the panel, if anyone would like to address this, so quickly we can try addressing this and move on to the next question.
So I'll say something about this. Before the pandemic, I probably would have said that we can't do effective SEL via screens because it requires eye contact or a feeling of closeness and connection that I didn't feel I could generate myself via screen. But now that I've spent a year and a half teaching students and mentoring them and making connections with others through screens, I've had to really revise my view. And I think that it's possible to have close connections through this medium by going back to some of what I think are the roots or the foundations of SEL, which is asking questions and sharing how we are, right? I mean, it's not complex, but asking questions. Sue, how are you? Tell me what's happening in your life. Spending and taking time to build a brief connection rather than jumping to something else. That's what SEL is about, at its core, which is rests on interactions and relationships. And so I think that can happen through screens. And I think we've all learned that to one degree or another, and we have to rely on it. So that doesn't mean, let me just add one thing, that I think computer games are going to be a tool for building SEL. I've been asked that question a lot. Can you make a digital game? And I'm not sure that's the case. I think there's a human connection, even if it happens through screens. That's
Dr. Stephanie, yes, Dr. Pan.
Yeah, just a sentence I wanted to add to what Dr. Stephanie said. During the pandemic, at least the first 6 months, our teachers did not know how to engage children actively through the online classes because there was no training, no preparation, nothing, right? But those 6 months were perhaps the best thing that could have happened to the children, that at least they could see their teachers on a screen and they could share their stories, and children could be emotionally secure in the presence of their teachers, right? So sometimes your present itself conveys a lot of things which are part of the SEL. But I think this question which the gentleman had asked is, the long hours of human interaction and long hours of online screening. Of course, when you are with humans, you are seeing a lot of things incidentally, right? Modeling, you're seeing how people behave, how they interact. Of course, those things cannot be substituted here. But I think Dr. Stephanie is saying that before pandemic, we would have said no, but the pandemic suggests yes.
There needs to be both.
Yes, exactly.
Never one or the other.
Exactly.
Right, that's right.
I've been teaching now SEL online, not only digitally, but also in China with Chinese translations. And it's been a steep learning curve for me, but actually it's been okay. We've managed to do that. And I've suggested maybe to teachers that they do things using the facilities that an online platform provides. And, they can get people into small breakout rooms to talk about things. And I'm surprised that not more of them are doing that, but it's certainly something that is on offer there.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I think UNODC has developed a very interesting game called Zorbs, ZORBS, and that works on civic skills. So you build a community and you have empathy, compassion, mindfulness, and critical inquiry applied there. So it's a very interesting game. If you want, you can check out.
We have done that. We have implemented it. It works the best.
So one thing I think that we need to know in our questions about what research do we need? Norris, Haynes identified that we need more longitudinal research that tracks things over long periods of time. I agree. I would say that we also need information about the degree to which what we learn online actually translates to what we do in the world when the world is playing a role. And that's something that I don't think we have good information about, except in the domain of executive function, where we know that training on a computer does not transfer to real world behavior. So something to learn.
Something to learn.
Very, very interesting, yes. Mm-hmm.
All right, so this is the final question before we move to the networking space. And the question is this. It was said that SEL pertains to skills that are developmental and they change over time. Would you say that the teaching and learning of SEL is culture bound? This is by Irvin. Anyone would like to go?
I had a lot to say about this, but I don't want to continue. So I'm going to let someone else jump in first.
Yeah, you start, Dr. Stephanie. We will follow you.
I think it's hard. I can't imagine saying that it's not culture bound. And culture is both big and small. We have family cultures, we have school cultures, we have community cultures, we have national cultures, and all kinds of other cultures. So it's hard for me to imagine that in this important domain that is so fundamentally about interactions and in some ways about what's valued, that we could remove culture from it. It's not consistent with what we know about these body of skills. It's not necessarily consistent with what we know about how they develop over time. That said, I do think from a developmental standpoint, there are some universals of human development that we could see as relevant all around the world. How we support those things and how they show up and how we talk about them is very much going to vary. So I think David said this when he was talking about self-management. There is a human need to regulate up, regulate down, regulate emotions, regulate behaviors, regulate physiology. Like that is something that is about human life and function. What regulation looks like, what is expected, what is valued, how we talk about it, and then the tools and the interactions and the supports we use to foster it, that's going to vary. And so I think the challenge for us is to always hold both of these in mind, right? Yeah. And so it makes the conversation difficult. It also makes it amazing, right? Because what's all this wonderfulness that we're learning about and talking about across our different contexts? So I said I could talk about it forever, and now I'm going to stop because I could keep going, and I won't.
Yeah.
And smiling is universal.
Yeah, that's right.
The analogy I tend to use for this is language development, right? And so language development, as Dr. Jones talked about, is a developmental process, right? It happens through interactions. The languages that we learn are context specific, right? They're culturally bound, but the functions within those languages are relatively similar, even though the specifics of those languages differ, right? So I think, Aaryan, you speak 4 or 5 languages. Did I get that right? Yeah,
absolutely.
And so when you're looking at how language develops, right, you'll notice there are different ways in different languages to get to the same processes, right, which is describing ourselves in the world. And I think that's how we talk about social and emotional learning, is that the constructs, this big idea is how to refer to oneself is a construct in all languages, right? And so in social and emotional learning, there are some pieces like that we need to ground in. And I think our challenge is going to be understanding what are these big, abstract, generalizable principles, and then what are the things that are going to be local to a language? How do certain languages communicate the difference between past and present? Those are things I think that are really interesting for the research space to continue to look into. But let's not lose ourselves and say nothing matters. There's no culturally generalizable pieces. But also, let's not get to the place where we're being imposing our cultural values without actually recognizing them. So,
right, and yeah, absolutely, and you know, the brain is universal, right? You know, the brain structures are universal, and when we teach to the cognitive areas of the brain as well as to the emotional areas of the brain. And so regardless to what culture I may reside in, those brain processes are universal. And so I think the cultural instantiation of what we do with respect to castle is how the language we use to translate that connection between the cognitions and the emotions into everyday practice. And so self-awareness is being aware of course, how we're processing things and how we're feeling about things. And that's universal. The question becomes, in various cultures, what language do we use to help people do that, right? Same thing with self-management, you know, and so on. So I think that you know, when I teach my students, there's a course I teach on learning, on human learning and taking learning into practice. I always begin with the brain because I think it's a common place where we begin to understand what we're talking about when we talk about social and emotional learning, and that's a universal. That's a universal way to approach it, I think.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haynes. We are running quite late, so I would like to time the next round. So this is the practical question where we ask you what is the one thing that educators can start doing as they implement SEL, and what is the one thing that they need to rethink or reconsider. So in the interest of time, I'm like timing it, so I need your help in ensuring we wrap early and we move on to the networking. So I would like Dr. Pandey to start with
Okay.
the response.
So you have given only 2 sentences. One, of course, the purpose of education, let it be community building, number one, right? And number two, catch them young and do not wait.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey, for that one. David, what are your practical, what do you call, responses to those two questions?
All right, Aaryan, start your timer. The first thing is that we need to name the things that we are doing. The most important things that educators need to do, regardless of the constructs that they're using to talk about social emotional learning, is that they need to name them so that we can have explicit understanding of them. The thing that they need to stop doing is talking about students as if the only way to develop social emotional skills is through direct instruction or curriculum. Bam.
Thank you for that one, David. Dr. Stephanie?
Okay, this is gonna be hard for me, so forgive me. I'm gonna steal something from Sue, and I'm sorry, Sue, but I feel the same way about this. I think we should play games, so that's what we should do more of. SEL is all in games, so let's play games. And then the thing I think I would say to stop doing is stop pretending that the systems that sit inside schools and the processes and procedures and structures of schooling are not connected to each other. So if we want to do effective SEL, we have to understand how it connects with our discipline systems, for example. Do they undermine each other or do they work together? So I'm going to say one more thing to stop doing, which is I think we have to stop politicizing things like SEL. In the US, there is a movement to make this somehow political, and that is a big problem. And I wouldn't want that to happen in other places.
Thank you so
let's
much.
stop doing that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stephanie, for that one. Dr. Sue?
I think I'm going to repeat what other people have said, really. First of all, is to make sure that we are all thinking about what education is for. What's it about? Is it for developing individual success, or is it about developing a safe and value-embedded society in which everybody feels valued and everybody matters? So in schools, I would say make sure that no child feels a failure. I'd do away with a lot of the competition in schools if it was up to me. And schools like childhood, and this is what Stephanie was saying, and I'd written it down already, is that SEL should be fun. Kids should actually find that they are really benefiting in so many ways from actually doing those activities and learning about themselves and other people.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sue. Dr. Haynes?
Right, I think we can do more of thinking of SEL developmentally, right, in terms of the developmental processes and the various levels of outcomes that we expect and could hope for. So I think we need to do more of that. I think we could stop thinking of SEL as one size fits all and one kind of SEL fits all. And so even though we have these 5 core competencies, I think we have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 kinds of ways we can think of implementation. There are those students who could benefit from a tier 1 type kind of SEL intervention, which is sort of a broad educational approach. But then you have those students who might be at the tier 3, who are dealing with some very serious issues.
Okay,
And,
let me
and
begin
so,
sharing with you a walkthrough video with one of the
okay.
most
I think there's
interesting
some
features.
issue. I'm so sorry,
Now,
Dr.
here you
Haynes.
have tables
Oh,
and
that's,
chairs in the network.
Oops. Okay. All right.
right.
Sorry, Dr.
Oh,
Haynes.
that's all right. Yes. So I'm finished actually, and then there's the sort of the tiers 2 and 3, so that I think there's students who could benefit from looking at SEL. So that one approach may not benefit all students. And thinking of where students are and what they might need, I think could be very helpful.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Haynes. Now we come towards the end of this panel discussion. So as we end this panel discussion, I would like to acknowledge that this is a moment for us to shape intentional and inclusive policies and nurturing practices towards creating an ecosystem that is truly empathetic, compassionate, mindful, and fosters a space for all educators and students to grow and thrive. Educators and school leaders, I believe, truly have the power and potential to affect this positive transformation. I do understand that we still have a lot of questions that we may not have been able to cover or answer them sufficiently through this panel discussion. And I do look forward to hearing from you your thoughts, ideas, and suggestions towards fostering social and emotional learning. Please send me an email or tag us in your posts on the social media. I would be delighted to know more from you. Also, do suggest what you'd like our future discussions to be on. And do not forget to join the global networking at the lounge, and do check out the booths at the exhibition. You'll find more information on Flowster, Traverse.link, Hybrid Learning Certified School Award Initiative, the Dotted Magazine, and the Youth Design Lab. On behalf of the Global Citizenship Foundation, the Council for Global Citizenship Education, Traverse.link, and Flowster, I thank our panelists, our attendees, and my deepest gratitude to all the contributing authors, to panelists, for taking the time out of the busy schedules and enriching the discourse through their amazing ideas, insights, and experiences. Also, I'd like to thank you for being part of the OELF family and for everything that you've been doing to advance the discourse on transforming education for human flourishing. We really appreciate the time, the insights, and the effort that you all have contributed to driving this extremely crucial discussion towards shaping the futures of education for generations of young people. Please proceed to the networking lounge event and expand your network and reach. See you soon. Until then, take care, stay safe, and spread love and compassion. Our world needs it more.